Welcome everybody, and yes, we are recording this. Lance has given permission that we will put the recording online later, so if you don't want to be seen, then do switch your camera off. So yes, and Lance, he is, let me introduce him, chair and core faculty of the Mythological Studies program at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, California, and in the 1970s he traveled with Joseph Campbell on mythological study tours of northern France, Egypt, and Kenya. And he's written numerous books, titles such as, if I find them here, this is one of them. This is his latest. How do you pronounce that?
Tikkun.
Yes. And also books such as The Myth of the Descent to the Underworld in Postmodern Literature, Descent to the Underworld in Literature, Painting and Film, 1895 to 1950, The Hero Journey in Literature. I think Lance has, more than anybody, charted how the myth of a descent to the underworld has been taken up by so many artists and painters and filmmakers, and not just in the modern era, but really throughout time, going back to the story of Inanna, which is a story that has informed and influenced, I know, our thinking about our new production of Descent, which we're staging in Birmingham at the end of July. So, Lance.
Yes, well, welcome everybody. As David said, this is one of those myths that is absolutely central in all of the world's great cultures. There are variations on the mythologies, not only in the literary text, of course, but also, of course, in a variety of artistic artifacts, and from ceramics to modernist paintings and film and novels and poems. It's one of the great mythologies that's so important to anybody interested in comparative literature and mythology. So what I would like to do, I gather I have about 50 minutes or so to present, and then some questions hopefully will come afterwards. I want to give you an abbreviated version of a lecture that I used to start a class on the mythologies of the underworld that I teach in the summer. And it's a class that goes 4 days in a row, 8 hours each. So there's a lot of material that's covered. And what I'd like to do now is establish a kind of basic framework for my approach to the mythologies, and then illustrate some key concepts in relationship to the myth of Inanna and some images from modernist film. So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen so that you have more interesting things to look at, and proceed. So as David mentioned, my introduction to mythology essentially came through my travels with Joseph Campbell. It's a wonderful story about meeting him. First in France to study the Grail romances. This is a picture from the cathedral in Rouen. And his notion of the hero journey cycle is, of course, central to the way I think of the mythology of the descent to the underworld, which I call the Nekia, from the Homeric term from Book 11. And it's a variation on the widespread distribution of the so-called hero journey cycle, beginning and ending in the same or similar place and going somewhere in between, moving in a counterclockwise direction from Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And when that hero journey goes downwards or goes to a place associated with death, the ancestral dead, the world of the spirits, we could call it a Nekia, a descent to and return from the underworld. Should the journey go upwards, moving from the Inferno to the Paradiso, let's say, it would then be a mythology associated with celestial ascent, leaving, departing, ascending, and returning. The interesting variation on this business is that the journey need not necessarily be on a vertical axis, moving up or moving down, especially when you move into the domain of the so-called Celtic / Welsh / Irish folk tales and ballads, where the movement is essentially horizontal, a hole in the hedge that moves horizontally from one domain to another. And that movement is a very interesting variation on the theme, and it introduces some complications in the hero journey cycle. A simple variation would be this image of a trip I took with Joseph Campbell on the right there to Egypt, crossing the Nile, standard image of the Nakia crossing a body of water to the undershore, in this case, the world of the dead, to the tombs on the other side of the Nile from Luxor and Karnak, moving towards the west. So we're here heading in that particular direction with some interesting conversations that I'd love to share with you, but we don't have time. Another important variation to mention is that this slide comes from Northrop Frye's book on the biblical narrative called The Great Code. And he simply points out that a large book like the Bible or Homer's Odyssey will typically have a repetition of a series of cycles of descent and return, moving, let's say, from Abraham to Jacob, to Joseph, to Jonah, repeating a cycle of descent and return to structure a large narrative or a big collection of stories. And Fry uses the sine wave curve as a geometrical symbol of that repeated pattern of descent and return. Tennyson's Idylls of the King would be a good example, where each of the chapters is structured in a similar way, from Camelot to some other place and then a return to Camelot. Now, one of the first things I typically have to do in the summer is to work with the terms underworld and try to dispel some immediate associations that students have. And those typically involve the notion of the underworld as a place of torment and suffering, sin and punishment and so forth. And the next couple of slides attempt to work with that stereotype and try to expand the notion of what we mean when we say the journey to the underworld. So these are some standard terms for that journey, underworld, netherworld. But I like the word otherworld, as in the Celtic and Irish, because it opens up the possibilities for the nature and geography of the journey, moving in a horizontal kind of direction. I came upon a wonderful collection of poems many years ago in a used bookstore with the title of Neither World, which beautifully captured that sense of the liminality of the space between one world and the next, somewhat like the Tibetan Bardo, to accommodate the simultaneous presence of both worlds. The term wonder world, however we want to say it, is from Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, where he talks about the overlord of the wonder worlds. And it's a typical Joycean pun that, works with the pun on wonder and under, and it also manages to get a little bit of the Anglo-Saxon weird in there as a place of fate and wonder and revelation. And then another postmodern author of great importance for the study of these mythologies is Krista Wolf, the Nobel Prize-winning novelist from Eastern Germany. And her books, Medea and Cassandra, use the term Gegenwelt, counter world, with that German word gegen, implying some tension between the two worlds, against. And in her case, it's a kind of patriarchal versus matriarchal tension that she explores in her quite extraordinary novels. So there's the nomenclature to consider to expand the notion of what people are experiencing when they go on this kind of a journey. Yesterday, I was trying to find the poetry book called Neither World on the internet. I couldn't find it, but I found this comic book, Beetlejuice, in the Neither World. And I couldn't resist throwing it in today because, of course, pop culture, graphic novels, various forms of video games, animated film, and so forth will very, very frequently employ these mythologies associated with the journey to the other world. And it's been quite a source of interest in recent years, devoted to pop culture variations on the theme. When I first started working with this material, again, I needed to shake things up a little bit by simply pointing out that the underworld in many ways is not just one place or one kind of place. It can be a variety of different places with different characteristics and qualities. In addition, of course, to Dante's notion of the inferno, the underworld as a Christian hell, place of punishment, pain, sin, and redemption, and so forth. But it's a considerably more than that. Even in Dante, you know, beginning with the encounter with Virgil and the other poets of the great tradition and classical antiquity, the encounter with the ancestors is almost always a part of this mythology. The underworld as a crypt or a vault where the ancestral dead speak and provide critical information about the fate and the destiny of the hero, whether it be Odysseus or Virgil's Aeneid, or in the dream of Scipio, the grandfather of Cicero, who provides fundamental information about the nature of the psyche, the cosmos, the fate of the soul, and so forth, all communicated through this encounter with the spirits of the ancestral dead. Typically, that encounter will occur in a special place of some kind, a temenos, a Greek term for a sacred space of revelation and transformation, where some deep hidden secret about the mysteries of life are revealed, with the result of a total transformation of the consciousness of the person undergoing the journey. To use Jungian terms, a kind of move from the ego of the conscious mind to the archetypal images of the deep psyche that transform the consciousness and identity of the hero. And that revelation of the basic structures of the archetypal images of the deep unconscious, I use the metaphor of the silo or the cornucopia, a place where the seed forms of the psyche are stored and manifested. So the underworld is a place of the revelation of these profound archetypal images. There's an iconography associated with the descent to the underworld. Often these will all be part of a kind of a mix, not one thing, not the other, but a mixture of all four different dimensions associated with the underworld. I also, because in type, I also needed to break up some other kinds of misconceptions or stereotypical images when we say underworld in Nicaea, associating it with death, and particularly in the Christian tradition with the crime and punishment. But in fact, the Nicaea is a metaphor for all kinds of creativity. And you find this in the text and in the films that associate the descent to the underworld with the production of some kind of beautiful artifact, like a poem or a painting, implicating the dynamics of poesis, the mysteries of the production or writing of a text. And that production of a text in these mythologies is naturally then associated with the process of hermeneusis, the reading and the interpretation of the text, so that in some way the Nicaea serves as an allegorical metaphor for the dynamic processes by which we move into the domain of the deep imagination, whether in the process of producing a text or in the very act of reading, which takes us into an otherworldly domain of the imagination. So it's a very flexible metaphor for the dynamics of creativity. And an image that you might think of course, here would be the papyrus of Ani and the Egyptian books of the dead, where you'll see Thoth, the ibis-headed deity, who's in the act of writing in a book, engaging the energies of poesis. And that what he's writing in the book has to do with the judgment. It must be read and understood by the person undergoing the journey. So in that context, it's not a surprise that the primary myth of analysis associated with Jungian psychology, as articulated by Jung himself, is the Nakia, the descent to and return from the underworld, which Jung called the Night Sea Journey in his breakaway book in 1912, Symbols of Transformation. So that process of entering into the domain of the deep imagination and engaging the archetypal images of the dream is the essential core of the individuation process in Jungian analysis. There again, with the creative result of the transformation of the individual and the creation of a new identity. On a very, very large scale, you find elements of this in the related mythologies associated with apocalypse, such as we have in the Book of Revelation. And D.H. Lawrence's beautiful book on apocalypse focuses in many ways on the importance of a mystery rite associated with the descent to and return from the underworld, so that the creation of the world and its destruction in a series of cycles in the Hindu context can also be seen in relationship to the mythology of the descent to and return from the underworld, where the entire cosmos disappears into the black oblivion of eternal space before the energies start all over again and a new cosmos emerges from it. So the key point here is that the Nakia is a mythology having to do with creativity as much as it is with a mythology having to do with death and crime and punishment and so forth. So one of the things that I began to work with was the language that we use to describe the special kinds of images that occur in a text or a film or a poem or a graphic novel when the mythology of the descent of the underworld becomes very clearly part of the text. And I simply took the words Nakia and archetype and combined them to create a third term, necrotype, essentially referring to the universal symbols of the human imagination, archetypes, that are activated, constellated, when the mythology of the Nakia becomes a central myth informing a text. And there are a wide range of such images that we could explore had we whirled enough in time to look at the whole history of European literature and art, where we'll find these motifs frequently coming up. And I'm going to be talking about some of them and illustrating them very briefly with respect to the descent of Inanna and a couple of modernist films in which the necrotypal imagery is very dramatic and very much a part of the book or the film. Of all of the necrotypal images associated with the descent to and return from the underworld, there is very frequently some powerful single image that encapsulates the mysteries of the entire cosmos in one image. And I've developed a vocabulary for that associated with what I call a hologlyph. But readers of Coleridge will remember that Coleridge had a special interest in the imagination, and he was particularly drawn to images that combine the opposites to create a single image of the totality of the cosmos. in his poetry. So this vocabulary informs my approach to the mythologies of the underworld. And many years ago, when I first started working on this, I got one of my colleagues in a school in Texas where I was teaching, who created what would now be seen as a fairly clunky, unsophisticated PowerPoint slide with the different necrotypes using the figure of the mandala to identify the different kinds of images that occur and the different kinds of language that is used to describe the essential characteristics of the journey to the other world. And we'll be exploring these images now, turning to the descent of Inanna. So let's then focus on the mythologies of the descent of Inanna briefly in the story to illustrate this notion of the necrotypes, certain characteristic universal symbols of the human imagination that emerge in a text or a poem or a play that engages the narrative structure of the Nekia. And as you know, this is quite a dramatic event, the discovery of the buried temples and tombs of the Middle East and the excavations of the early 20th century of particular importance for the descent of Inanna, the excavations of Sir Leonard Woolley and his excavation of the ziggurat that you'll see in progress here from an old plate. Digging down underneath below, archaeological work is a kind of Nekia, unearthing the stratifications of the underworld buried under the sands of the desert for almost 2,000 years. And then the recovery of the text and the artifacts associated with them. And this is from Leonard Woolley's plan for the Royal Cemetery of Ur down the road from the ziggurat that takes us back to an old Sati ritual burial site that Joseph Campbell discusses in his works in relationship to the story, the mythology of the descent of Inanna. And I want to say more about those artifacts in just a second, but this particular plate reminds us that there's a kind of architectural necrotype, certain kinds of spaces, often labyrinthine spaces associated with temples and tombs, staircases and doorways, sacred spaces in which objects are to be found. Is a very important aspect of the mythology of the underworld, whether it be in the form of a text or a play or a film. So here is Leonard Woolley in the process of bringing these extraordinary artifacts back from his excavations in Mesopotamia associated with the Royal Cemetery of Ur. And these are critical because without those excavations of the tombs, the temples, and the libraries of Ashurbanipal, we would not have the texts that have yielded the complete narrative story of the descents of Inanna and Gilgamesh and so forth. So that the archaeological work frequently involves the revelation of some mysterious text that needs then to be interpreted and translated. As for example, this little piece of the story of Inanna from a beautiful stone bowl from the Oriental Museum at the University of Chicago, which has the little piece of the story. So the revelation of some mysterious text is a very important part of the mythologies of the Nekia, along with the challenge of deciphering and translating the texts. Now here again is Leonard Woolley with one of the most important and spectacular artifacts from the excavations in the Royal Cemetery. This is how it looked originally with the bull's head and the harp. Here it is cleaned up. And, I think this is in the British Museum, but I'm not sure. And it shows us this wonderful harp with the head of a bull on it. And on the sides of the harp, down here, you'll see panels that illustrate various folk tales from the Mesopotamian traditions of the Sumerians. And they include images of the story of Gilgamesh, and then some other images from Aesop fable kinds of folk tales from the Sumerian culture. And I include it to emphasize the fact that the underworld is a place of poesis. It's a place associated with stories, with the revelation of texts. Often those stories occur in the accompaniment of musical instruments of some sort. So there's a special kind of language, a special kind of music that gets constellated by the descent to the underworld. And these are two more images that I took on the iPhone from the Oriental Museum at the University of Chicago. And it shows a harp player on the left and a person on the right playing a double flute, like an Alice. The point being that there's a special language, a special music that gets constellated in relationship to storytelling in the mythologies of the Nakia. This is another image from the excavations of Sir Leonard Woolley of the adornments and jewelry associated with one of the princesses who was buried along with the rest of the court. And those artifacts are very, very important for the iconography of the descent to the underworld as we have it in the text of the story, which is fairly complete now, but there's still pieces left to be found. So if we reassemble the jewelry and the artifacts that you'll see here, some very important things begin to emerge that will relate to our story when those adornments are applied here using a mannequin, which I would like us to think about briefly as an image of Inanna in the story associated with her journey to the underworld. And this is an old image from a slide I took of Joseph Campbell's Historical Atlas of World Mythology. And it shows all of that image, all of that beautiful jewelry on this beautiful mannequin. And that jewelry and that clothing is going to be very important aspect of our exploration of the necrotypes. So with that brief introduction, I just want briefly to turn to the story of the descent of Inanna and to highlight some of the necrotypal images that occur in the story itself. The lunar symbolism of the bull, the astronomical symbolism associated with the moon and the planet Venus, architectural, but particularly this complex of images in the initiation phase of the descent of Inanna, which involves a passage through a series of doorways, 7 of them, implicating the threshold necrotype, and the symbolism of clothing, where Inanna is stripped down of her articles of royal symbols of her royal power. As she passes through each one of the doorways, one of her articles of clothing or jewelry is stripped away from her until she stands completely naked in the presence of her sister, the goddess of the underworld, Ereshkigal, who kills her with what's called an eye of wrath. And this implicates the very, very important necrotype of eye symbolism, the ocular motif. So what I'd like to demonstrate briefly this morning is the convergence of those 3 complex images, thresholds, clothing symbolism, and eye symbolism, and the way that that fundamental complex of images becomes a standard kind of dynamic all the way from the descent of Inanna to more contemporary examples of the myth in the films of Cocteau and Bergman or in the novels of Thomas Pynchon. This synthesis of doorways, clothing, and eye symbolism. So briefly, let's explore some of those necrotypes first in the story, beginning with the lunar bull. At the beginning of the descent of Inanna, we're told that she's heard a call from the great below. And the call seems to be a summons to a funeral. And the funeral is the funeral of a relative, a brother-in-law named Gugalana, who is a lunar bull. And this implicates the very important symbolism of the moon associated with the Nakia because of its phases, moving into the 3 dark nights of the moon, the underworld from which it is reborn in the form of the new world, manifested in the symbolic form of the sacrificial animal of the bull, with its horns that echo the structure, the appearance of the moon in the crescent new moon and in the waning moon. So this convergence becomes a very important part of the story when Inanna goes down to the underworld to celebrate the funeral of Gugalana, the moon bull. She will eventually find that, in fact, there's a birth in progress. Ereshkigal is giving birth, so that the bull, the moon, are symbols of that dynamic polarity of birth and death in the cycles of the moon. And that becomes a standard astronomical zoomorphic symbol of the Nakia. Now, in terms of the story itself, we're told that Inanna has to visit all of her temples in the city of Ur before she departs. In fact, she goes to 6 or 7 different cities in preparation for her journey. So one can imagine a ritual, public, communal event like the one associated with the production of your play that involves the entire community in these annual cycles of descent and return associated with Inanna as a goddess and a priestess in the Sumerian cities of Ur. And this would bring into the mix the complicated architectural and urban cityscape kind of imagery that is frequently implicated in the mythologies of the journey to the underworld. As for example, in a modern film like Cocteau's Orphée, when Orpheus goes downtown in Paris and sees the princess of the underworld and chases her through the labyrinthine arcades of one of the plazas in Paris, so that the city itself in Cocteau can become a kind of an underworldly location. Now, in preparation for her descent, Inanna puts on all of her items of royal clothing with symbolic indications of her spiritual and political power. And each article of clothing is named in the text. And she does this in preparation for her descent to the underworld. And I call this the investiture necrotype, putting on some kind of special symbolic clothing that will eventually be stripped away in the inverse dynamic of divestiture, stripping down, because Inanna is going to go through the 7 gateways and an article of royal clothing will be stripped down along the way. And here's the reconstruction of that rather spectacular jewelry associated with the royal cemetery of Ur. Now once she's gotten herself appropriately dressed for the occasion, she begins her process of the descent to the underworld, going through the 7 gateways. And at each of the gateways to the underworld, those articles of royal clothing will be stripped away from her in the dynamic process of divestiture, stripping down until she stands completely naked in the presence of her sister Ereshkigal. This is an image I took a long time ago from a text of the descent of Inanna, and it shows a very, very early ceramic, somewhere between 2500 and 3000 BC. And it represents one of the gateways leading into the underworld through which the goddess Inanna will pass. You can't see it very well in this slide, but in the dark space of the doorway, there is a rather ominous, sinister beak pointed out at us, like the beak of a vulture, which would implicate what I like to call the ornithological necrotype. Certain kinds of birds are traditionally associated with the journey to the other world from very, very early on. So we can imagine her passing through the gateways here, being completely stripped down. We know from the context of the story that she's basically at midlife. And we know what happens at midlife. It's when the divorces happen. It's when we get fired and lose our jobs. It's when we go to the doctor's office and the bad news is given to us about our cancers. So it represents a dramatic shift where everything that we had identified with in our lives is suddenly stripped away from us, is taken away until we are in a kind of naked vulnerability. And that process psychologically is represented in the imagery of divestiture, having all of her royal accoutrements being stripped away from her. Now, the edition of the Descent of Inanna that I use is one associated with Samuel Noah Kramer and Diane Volkstein. It's a Harper and Row paperback. And I still love it because it's got an appendix of artistic images of the cylinder seals that were excavated during this process of archaeological exploration in the Middle East. The clay tablets that have images rolled out on them to create a cylinder that you will see an abundance of when you go to the Louvre in Paris. They've got an extraordinary room full of these cylinder seals. And the iconography here is a good place to start a conversation about necrotypes. It's got the symbols of the doorway with the doorway post in the bottom part of the image, the passage through which leads into the underworld, the threshold necrotype. And then above it, it's got the critical motif of the astronomical necrotypes associated with Venus, the planet, symbolized in the Sumerian world by the goddess Inanna. And the number 8 is of critical importance for the cyclical appearance and return and disappearance of Venus. Not only the diurnal cycle where Venus goes down into the underworld in the evening and returns in the morning, Tennyson's Hesperus and Vesperus, but also the longer cycles of time associated with the rising and setting of the planet Venus based on replications of the number 8 over 16-year periods. And it's Campbell's notion that this would indicate the sacred calendars of ritual sacrifice associated with the kings of the royal cemetery of Ur. However that may be, this rosette, like 8-petaled symbol of the planet Venus becomes an important central necrotype in the tradition of the mythologies of the underworld. Along with the astronomical and the threshold iconographies in the story, there are, of course, the ocular motifs associated with the eye of wrath that is fastened upon Inanna by her very jealous and angry sister, Ereshkigal. The myth is a myth about families, by the way. All the relationships and families are included in the text. So it's that particular synthesis of ocular, divestiture, and threshold imagery established in about 2000 BC, which would be the date for our earliest versions of the text, that persists all the way up into the present. And I want to explore that in the little bit of time that we have left. Here are some little eye goddesses from the ancient Mediterranean world, indicating the widespread distribution of the eye goddesses of death and rebirth all over the Mediterranean. these beautiful, mesmerizing little artifacts, which you will find in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. They're quite extraordinary little things. And typically, in these early mythologies, the underworld is presided over by the divine feminine, Ereshkigal, Inanna, Demeter, and Persephone, so that the iconography of the great goddess comes into the conversation, as was addressed by Miranda Green a couple of weeks ago in her wonderful presentation. So here's a little goddess from the excavations in the University of Chicago Museum. And I wanted to include it not only because of the rather odd ocular and ornithological symbolism of the face, but also the geometrical symbolism of the two triangles joined at the position of the womb, downward and upward pointed, which becomes a very important aspect of the mythologies of the great goddess associated with death and rebirth, what I like to call a geometrical necrotype. Now, to finish with our work, we've got, I think, just enough time. Let me show you some images from films that you're probably familiar with, in which the iconography of the necrotypes is quite dramatically present. And beginning with Murnau's Nosferatu, which is a great early film devoted to the journey to the underworld. And this is an image of Nosferatu in his palace in Transylvania, emerging from a doorway. And you'll notice that in Murnau's film, the doorways associated with the other world are Gothic pointed arches, whereas the journey of the domestic world of Harner and his wife in the little German city are almost always Romanesque arches in the architecture of the patrician homes of the city. So the architectural and threshold imagery is very important in the film version of Nosferatu. Here's a variation on the threshold images when the ship arrives at the city of Bremen and Nosferatu crawls out of his coffin, emerging from a hatch, walking up a staircase. And one will often find in the film world, particularly, the images of staircases and windows as variations on the thresholds between the two worlds. If we think briefly about Cocteau's famous film, Orphée, retelling a story of critical importance for the mythologies of the underworld, the story of Orpheus, who becomes in Cocteau a kind of archetypal poet. And the mythologies of the Nicaea are allegorical representations of the creative dynamics of poetry, the production of a mysterious text. And this is Orpheus returning from his first experience of the otherworldly chateau, where he's encountered the princess of death. And he's waking up by the shore with his head over this pool of water that's reflecting his image. And I bring this into the conversation because mirrors as thresholds are often to be found in modernist literature and film as a variation on the threshold between the two worlds. And this is an image of Orpheus's descent to the underworld, led by the chauffeur of the princess of death, Hertobes. And you can see from this image that we have passed through a series of doorways, moving into a labyrinthine maze-like structure of an old estate on the outskirts of Paris that was severely damaged by the war. And this becomes the architectural space in the film associated with the underworld into which Orpheus is now descending. Cocteau's other very famous film, Beauty and the Beast, is saturated with dynamic sequences that involve passages through doorways and corridors and staircases as Beauty makes her way into the mysteries of the chateau of the beast. And here she is entering her room in this absolutely splendid scene from the film, which Cocteau uses to great effect, and that where he's able to combine the threshold imagery with the imagery of divestiture and reinvestiture. When in another sequence, Beauty walks through that door, carried by the beast, her dress is transformed as she walks through the door from this peasant costume to a very ornate, aristocratic, upper class kind of evening gown. So the synthesis of clothing symbolism, divestiture and reinvestiture will eventually lead to the important related symbol of ocular necrotype when Beauty goes into her room and lies down in bed and is awakened by the beast. And the beast warns her never on any occasion whatsoever to look him in the eye. So here is Cocteau's beautiful version of the beast with this quite fascinating synthesis of ocular clothing and threshold imagery that structures the film. Another favorite for me is Bergman's great film Wild Strawberries, which is structured by a sequence of 3 dream visions at the beginning, middle, and end of the film. And they also implicate the iconography of the necrotypes, as in this first dream that Isak has, with the complicated labyrinthine sequence of dark doorways in the inner city that Bergman is able to combine with the important ocular symbolism on the clock that Isaac walks under here before he sees a carriage rolling down the street that deposits a coffin on the sidewalk, and he goes over to the coffin and a hand is reaching up. He looks down into the coffin and he sees his own face. And the eyes become prominent as the corpse slowly emerges from the coffin and stares directly into Isak's face and wakes him up. So that sense of an urban landscape with a series of dark doorways implicating the iconography of the eye symbolism in relationship to death recurs throughout the course of the film. And I wish I was able to show a little snippet of the film, but haven't learned how to do that yet with the PowerPoint Zoom situation. But the second dream is of particular importance for us, because in this second dream, Isak comes at night in the moonlight to a mysterious house in the country. And he reaches up to look through the window, and he cuts himself on some iron nails that are on either side of the doorway. And you'll see his stigmata here at the doorway, through which he is going to make his way into this mysterious country cottage. The first thing he's going to do when he gets inside the cottage is take off his overcoat and hang it up on a peg, implicating the stripping down that's about to occur as he descends into the basement of this mysterious country estate and finds himself confronting a medical exam room in this spectacular scene in Wild Strawberries of the examination. And I included this slide partly because it was one of the few I could find that was of decent quality for the film, because it's got a mysterious text on the back, on the blackboard, implicating the imagery of poesis. And that text now needs to be read and interpreted. And it's in a language that Isak does not understand. It's a special language of the world of the dead. And it indicates the imminent failure of the exam which is to look into that microscope and identify the specimen of the microscope inside on the slide in the microscope. When he looks into the microscope, he sees his own eye reflected. And this is a dramatic moment in the film. So what Bergman has done is combined these characteristic images of the Nekia: nighttime, the moonlight, thresholds, divestiture, descent through a staircase to a sequence of rooms, with an ultimate encounter with this eye of death, you might say, that is included in the film. Just to finish up, the final dream in Wild Strawberries is actually a kind of reverie as Isaac lies falling asleep, and he thinks back to this beautiful visit he'd had with his cousin in this country estate on a lake in Sweden. And here is this wonderful scene when this beautiful young woman holds the mirror up for Isaac to contemplate, you know, the realities of his aging. And it brings that whole beautiful symbolism of the mirror into the iconography of the Nekia, and the very important symbolism of the archetypal feminine, who serves as a sort of guide of souls to the underworld in Cocteau's wonderful film. So that's a quick exploration of the iconography of the Nekia, focusing on certain key images: ocular, divestiture, threshold imagery, mirrors, and so forth, that we can track all the way from 2000 BC up to the 1950s, when Cocteau and Bergman were just hitting their stride as great modernist filmmakers.
Thank you very much, Hans. That was wonderful.
Thank you, David.
Fascinating. And I think it's important what you're doing in analyzing the journey to the underworld and analyzing it in such a clear way as well, and the imagery as what you call the necrotypes and charting them. I think once you start to point them out, then I find myself saying, oh yes, there it is, there it is, there it is, there's this image, there's this image, there's this necrotype. So yes. Really, thank you very much. And we've got some people here today from our production team. We've got David Calcutt, the writer. We've got Lilith Piper, the artist. We've got John Bell, the designer. And so, David, you've written this play, and you've got a character called Inanna in it. It happens by chance. So, have you got any thoughts?
By sheer coincidence, have I got any thoughts? No, no. I mean, I just found that absolutely fascinating, Lance. I really, really did.
Thank you.
It made me realise that I kind of didn't know what I was doing half the time when I was writing the play.
That's usually the best way to proceed.
Yeah, I was just simply going by instinct, but I think I kind of stumbled upon one or two things that seemed to be right.
Well, I was sitting here, David, sorry, I was sitting here ticking off things that we've done. I thought, oh yeah, we've got that, we've got that, we've got that.
Yes, we did. Yeah, we did. And it which is interesting that I mean, just speaking as a writer, that the imagery you're talking about, I mean, when the writing is going well and when you're kind of into that world, when you've descended, so to speak, then the images and the ideas arise spontaneously.
Yes, that's the great mystery.
They almost don't have to be worked for. It's as if, well, they are. They're there, waiting to be tapped into. It seems to me. And I know when I was first writing the script, I mean, that's what was happening. And you know when something's worked, when it just seems right, and you can't really explain why it seems right, but it just does. And then someone like you comes along and explains why it's right.
the mysteries, the great mysteries of poesis.
It is a mysterious act. It is indeed. Yeah. But thank you, Lance. I found that absolutely fascinating.
But
Thank
it is
you,
the
David.
question. It is a question, really, isn't it? When you see people like Bergman using these motifs, how conscious they are that they're using it, or whether they have.
That's what I was wondering while I was watching the clip of especially of the clock and the eyes and so on and so forth, and the coffin. It just seemed as if he'd attended one of your lectures.
Right.
To use the imagery, but of course that's not the case. So I mean, would those images be arising spontaneously? I mean,
I think so, and I think Thomas Mann provided a really good approach to the question when he distinguishes between the Dionysian and the Apollonian in his own work. And he essentially associates the Dionysian principle with the spontaneous manifestation of the images activated in the process of writing unconsciously, but then they get worked by the Apollonian principle and are provided, shape and significance and structure in a very conscious way for an artist like Thomas Mann. And we'd have similar questions, I think, to ask Bergman if we could about how those images evolved and emerged while he was doing the filming.
That's the Dionysian and Apollonian makes sense to me a lot.
Yeah.
So we have, I think we can go on a little bit over time, and I open it up to some more questions. If people have got questions, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question. I know that Yvonne has asked a question in the chat. She said, what are the images behind Lance? Can you explain them, Lance, to us?
That's a little Mayan ceramic from the hall where I go to. When I used to be able to go to my office, I would walk to a place, and this is right outside my office. It's a beautiful little contemporary Mayan corn goddess that I took a picture of on my iPhone because I teach a course in Native American mythologies, and we do quite a bit with the Mayan material, where the key descent to the underworld is associated with the ball game that the twins play with the lords of Xibalba, the lords of the dead. They don't end up, finally defeating the lords of the dead, but they do modify the extent and range of the powers of death in significant ways in the Mayan text of the Popol Vuh. So that's the reason I've got that little beautiful little ceramic goddess there on my screensaver.
Well, that's an interesting question.
So we've got a question from Ed. To what extent does the iconography common to different descent narratives map to our understanding of human psychology? I suppose you would say it does map to a Jungian understanding, perhaps, of human psychology.
Yeah, I think either Freud or Jung, any depth psychological framework that explores the images of the unconscious, whether manifested in dreams or fantasies or symptoms, would be a good example of what's happened to the mythologies of the underworld in the 20th century, where essentially the underworld is the unconscious. Okay, for both Freud and Jung, with changes that develop when we go to the post-Jungian world of James Hillman, for example. But it's very much a part of the psychologies of Freud and Jung as an image of the unconscious.
Can I open it up to any more questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I so much enjoyed it. I've just actually looked up your book on the descent on the web, and I see that the cheapest copy is about $200, even second.
Don't believe it. When you go on Amazon, they've got some sort of bizarre algorithm where my books end up costing $1,000. Try something like, in our country at least, Abe Books or Powell Books, and I don't know what the services would be in England, but you can usually find something more reasonably priced.
Brilliant, thank you. Because I was going to ask you whether you were going to republish it in that case, because obviously
I'm thinking I should.
Yes.
So it doesn't cost that, especially for my students who I'd like to have access to my work.
Well, one of the books that you can get fairly reasonably is The Hero Journey in Literature, which is a kind of goes through in Anna and goes through sort of well, do you want to explain what you cover in the book, Lance?
Way too much. This is an ambitious interdisciplinary graduate student who's violating all the rules about academic specialization, and moving from Homer and Inanna to the films that I talked about. So it tries to track the evolution of the hero journey cycle throughout the course of European literature. The kind of things that graduate students think they could do, some hubris involved. But the ones that are more focused on the underworld are the ones that have the underworld in the title. There are two of them: The Descent to the Underworld in Modernism and The Descent to the Underworld in Postmodernism. And those are the ones that have discussions not only of the literature, but of the films, and in some cases the art of the modernist era. And there again, poke around, don't rely on Amazon to try to find an affordable copy.
I've just found some viewer books on Abe Books, and they are considerably cheaper than £200.
Yeah, I use Abe quite a bit.
Yeah.
I use it too much, to tell you the truth, but you can find good books at reasonable prices on Abe.
Yeah, they are, and there's quite a few by James Campbell as well.
Yes.
Yeah, they're there.
And somebody has posted, let me just check who it is. It's John. Do you think that scientists today and their explorations of black holes, the singularity and multiverses is a refinding of Nikia to a degree?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, you remember that historian of science named Jacob Bernofsky, who did a series called Cosmos many years ago. Yeah. He very explicitly referred to what he called the underworld of matter. And his concept was of the behavior of the nuclear and subnuclear particles in a domain beneath the surface of things, and used that as a kind of metaphorical underworld in his approach to the new physics of, Einstein and Niels Bohr and Heisenberg and so forth. So absolutely do think that this mythology of the underworld is very important for the new physics. Yes, Ascent of Man, that's it. I'm seeing it in chat. I'm slowly learning how to read the chat and speak at the same time, which is not always easy. Yes, the Ascent of Man in the first chapter, I think.
It might be useful for you, lads. You have a website, don't you, where you have lots of material, including images of...
I do, and some of the images are okay. I'm not totally happy with their quality, but I do have a blog called Conjunctio, the alchemical term, and I started to post things there several years ago. So you can find some of this material that way. Yeah.
So I recommend that. And Lance, I think we should wrap up, but I thank you very much. That was fascinating, wonderful pictures of that really of Inanna's journey. I'm sure it's inspired some of the artists who are listening and watching today. So thank you, Lance. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. And next week, on the 7th, next Wednesday, we have a talk by Gwyneth Hood on Dante's descent to the underworld, Dante's dreams of the underworld. And I hope you can all join us for that. I'm sure that will be fascinating too. I'm really looking forward to that. So thank you, everyone, and good night. Good night, Lance.
Thank you all. So nice to meet everybody. We'll see you next week.